Assalamualaikum and greetings to everyone. Thank you to the organizer that gave me the opportunity to share some experience and approach from my teaching, particularly online teaching, and also share some student experience in this kind of classroom. So what I can say that the approach may be not so distinct to other lecturers' approach, but I believe that each of the academician we have their own, we have our own style and preferences, uh, certainly with a single objective to deliver the content the best as possible. So in this modern era, we have a generation of students that generally different from the previous one, so-called Gen Z. So in this talk, I would like to touch a bit what is the generation, the possible way to integrate the lesson and assessment, suit to their way of thinking, which I prefer to relate to their character as well. So the title of the talk is The Sense of Self-Determined Learning, which targeted for individual activity. In this talk, I will revise a bit on the Generation Z and how Heutagogy relevant to this generation. Then, before we look at how I adapt the concept to the online assessment, I will give a bit the scenario of approaches or teaching and learning style in recent days. So we can do some comparison here. So as a introduction to Generation Z, we have some words that to describe this generation. This generation, they known to have this phygital, hyper custom, realistic, FOMO, DIY, and so on. So I just choose 5 of them that may be relevant to our teaching approach. So before we go in a little bit more detail on this Generation Z, maybe I can explain a bit what is phygital. It's a combination of physical and a digital world. So they're hardly to differentiate between the real and the digital world. From their mind, they say that the digital world is the real world. So they cannot live without gadget and internet. This is, the worst scenario. They look to their gadget more than the real world, basically. Hyper custom is the student, preference. So they already live in a digital world that they can custom what they want. Just like we want to order foods from Food Panda and GrabFood, so we can choose the menu, and just like Tea Life, you can custom the content in the drink. So the third one is realistic, means that they will get information about almost everything without our instruction. Whenever they have a question, they will search and they try to evaluate what people say or the new knowledge to them. So they will Google and search whatever they wanted to know. So they maybe will accept any information without checking the truth. Indirectly, this is our role to cultivate and guide them. So you should teach them, right, to filter the information before accepting the information that posted in internet. And the fourth one is FOMO. Yeah, it is stand for fear of missing out. So basically, they wanted to be the first person know something, especially from the med source. For them, it is the major way to communicate with their friends and family. And for the last one, I think DIY, everybody knows that, do it yourself. So this generation, they willing to try a lot of things by themselves, including the challenge one. And from this fact, they say they recorded that average 3 hours a day, this generation facing their mobile device. But I am doubt about this because due to this pandemic and restriction, we also conduct the the classes online, and one in a day they maybe have to face 3 or 4 lecturers. So definitely the screen time is more than 3 hours a day. So the previous slide showed the behavior or the character of Generation Z overall, all over the world. But what about Generation Z in Malaysia? This generation contribute to a quarter of Malaysian population, and 99% of them, they own their own device, and of course when they have device, um, definitely they need internet. So internet penetration is nearly 100% as well. If we relate to the previous slide, where there are digital, hyper custom, and so on, they are actually very good with crowdsourcing. So this is their skill, and they're able to process a large amount of information, right? However, they are very fragile. Uh, they, they, they have a quite high tendency to get depression and anxiety problem. This is the problem that we heard recently when there was a news about student pass away because of stress with uh, learning burden. So from this generalization character of Gen Z, what we expect are the character. So most of them, they are more independent than the millennial generation, and they are very good with business and trading. So they willing to try new things for their career, and not surprised that they use their hobby as their profession. And one thing about them is they use salary as their uh, measurement scale for life achievement. Internet definitely is their main source, and of course Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and so on is the popular platform for this generation. So the question is, what type of education environment suit to them? All right, maybe we as a lecturer, student approaches, maybe text us, WhatsApp, and so on, and they might ask some question, or they tell us something like, okay, I found a website saying that different from what we thought, what we post in the spectrum, or maybe they also confused with some web pages, which one is correct, and maybe they argue, or they also find some answer from Quora. This is quite popular homepage now. People can ask question, and other people will answer the question for you. So this is simple observation to show that some students are not hesitate to find the answer by their own. So the learning process should also focus on what and how question the learner want to learn, and not only on what is to be taught. Okay, so the burst of information on the internet maybe cause the student misguided and confused. That's the worst scenario. But some student, they can gain more information, gain more knowledge. So this is advantage for them. So with a little trigger and guide from us, they will explore more information and will be back to us to filter and evaluate. So what we want to create an effective learning environment that the student simply enjoy and experience satisfaction from the learning. They develop the desire and the skills to be better and more effective learners from what they already good with. For example, like I said just now, crowdsourcing and hyper custom. So we can use their talent here, their skill in this learning process in our class. So the question is how the learner can be guided in their learning. We as a lecturer maybe get used to giving lecture in one way or two-ways communication. Conventionally, we have lecture sessions, a couple of tutorials, and definitely an examination. We may feel this is the reasonable and easier way for the students to capture content. Of course, we do expect that the student will do the revision again and again until they understand the topics. We may realize how much they understand certain topic when we do an examination for them, but it's too late. From the heutagogical perspective, it's obvious that the students are at the center of the learning process. When we define the learning process as a student-centered, we ourselves will be no longer a lecturer that give a lecture most of the time. Our position could be as a facilitator, a coach, a motivator, an educator, or a mentor. Maybe we question ourselves how to deliver content if we are not doing it. It is certainly a dilemma between giving lectures and become a coach in a class. In this talk, I will share how I apply the so-called self-determined learning in my classroom. Well, from my experience, it is quite challenging for me to adapt this heutagogy from physical and face-to-face classroom to the virtual situation. There are a few issues that I personally couldn't find the right answer to apply this heutagogical approach for a group activity. So I will limit my sharing for individual activities only. No doubt that we had been introduced to different teaching and learning style, like blended learning, active learning, flipped classroom, and learning by doing. Some of us may be fan to these methods. There is no wrong about it and will always be a fun factor for the student when they have these varieties. However, when we design an activity with the sense of self-determined learning, we might drag the activity becomes too wide, which is a disaster for us to evaluate and maybe ended up out of scope. Or if the designed activity become too narrow and rigid, it will back to the traditional quizzes and tutorial. Maybe we can think of asking students to do some assignment where the student will explore and send back to us the answer where the answer scheme is already in our hand. So it is back to square one and we not use their real Generation Z skills or talent such as crowdsourcing and hyper custom. From my experience, whatever I design an activity, I always hold to the two principles. The first one is control the scope of a lesson, and the second one is steer the expected finding. From these principles, we will go to the next step. It is an activity framework. From the principle, we can design an activity which is main concern is developing instruction. In the other two stages, implementation and evaluation process can be similar to what we are all been doing in our classroom. It is good if we can link the proposed assignment and the student's skill or talent. The character of Generation Z student will always be the orientation to develop the instruction. In this part, we will compare the heutagogical value to the common method. For usual method, we always give a simple instruction, such as answer all the question, or we do gamify activity using Spectrum, Google Form, Kahoot, or similar platforms. The instruction also rigid and aim for specific solution for each problem. It is obviously because we hope that the student will use our lecture note and textbook to answer the question. However, for heutagogical perspective, the instruction will be more meticulous. It is driven by the possibilities of answers that eventually found by the student from their search and crowdsourcing talent. The larger range of answers also should be expected, especially from a bigger class. Since the potential of student to find information beyond the learning objective, we should include the limits or rules in the instruction so that we can narrow a bit the possibility of the expected answers. In order to ensure the instruction is within the scope, I do the run test and look at all the possibility of answers that potentially found by the student. The next stage is implementing the activity. Usually when we have a set of question and an answer scheme, we would expect only one specific answer for a problem. This is different from self-determined learning, where the student will find the answers at will. They will choose their preference a problem within the scope. They may query and possibly ask some question because technically there is no answer scheme that can be found, especially from the lecture notes. I think that I realize the student really appreciate the open access submission. Means they're not worried to show their own finding simply because they are aware that the answer could be different from the rest. The final stage is evaluation process. For the common method, it is quite straightforward. The expected answer would be the same for all students. And the students almost certain will ask for the answer scheme to check their answer. For the self-determined learning, they rarely ask for the answer scheme. They rather to ask for reasoning and get further explanation from me if they disagree with the feedback. Sometimes I use the argument to ask the rest of the class and then let them explain openly in a discussion session. One more thing about evaluating stage is that there would be more flexible marking scheme. Now we have a framework ready. The next slide would be a couple of real activity and assessment that I did in my class. To test how the design activity are effective and the student still able to gain the expected content, the chosen topic usually is something that not obvious or present in the lecture note. So that when the activity ended, we should able to see if they able to gain the expected knowledge while the content is never appear in the notes. Okay, this is an example of a simple activity that requires the student to find and redraw a molecule structure. Here I limit the scope to organic dyes, antibacterial drug and disaccharide. This is an example of instruction to suit to hyper custom. Then I ask them to draw on a piece of paper before redraw it on mole view. So this related to their phygital character. The following instruction is posting on Padlet where their friends can comment and give a rating to their post. So I would say that this is related to FOMO character. Well, when the student get the instruction, there is a flow of activity that we can observe. After the student had their time to choose the structure, they just reread the instruction step by step until they redraw the structure on mole view. So here we can see the screenshot of what they have drawn. It is obvious that the results are very different from one to the other. Each of them, they have their own preferences for the category as well as the structure that they found. I used their finding for the next lesson, which related to determine the hybridization state. This is the second example. Here is another example of activity for the student to learn intermolecular interaction, which then relate the concept to solvent miscibility. The student required to choose only 4 solvents out of common organic solvent. Again, this is the example of hypercustom character. I let the student to search and use any web-based chemical drawing to redraw the solvent structure. This part, they should able to use their crowdsourcing talent. Then they have to draw the possible interaction between the molecule in pairs. Again, the result or answer from the student potentially will be different from the rest. In this stage, the student have found range of information, but remember that the instruction is obviously limit their finding into only 4 solvents, so that I won't expect the student to find a complicated result. So they did the analysis and write the finding and the drawing before converted into PDF file. Here, I did not use Padlet or similar open access platform. So I just asked the student to submit to me through Google Form, and I check each answer script. In this evaluation stage, I check the answer one by one. So the answer script were collected in a Dropbox folder and shared back to the student. This means each of them able to see other PDF with my comments and given marks. So this is also considered as an open access, which is relevant to their formal character. What I found so far, as I mentioned before, the activity design were not directly driven from the lecture notes. So they were hesitant to use their Generation Z skill like hypercustom, FOMO, and digital. I'm not surprised using this approach also drive the student to explore and gain the knowledge without my presence in front of them giving an hour lecture. What I can say from this kind of approach of self-determined learning, the student will not hesitate to participate in the activity. They show their motivation and enthusiasm to find the answer. They not worry to share the answer because the answer will be different from others. Feedbacks from their colleagues are always welcomed and expected. Lecturer can control the limit on how far the student will dive and explore. Some evaluation results still accountable for continuous assessment mark. So with that, I end this talk with this quote by Imam Ibn al-Jawzi. He said that to achieve any objective, we need 2 things. The first one, motivation, and the second one, right strategy. So with that, thank you very much.